told you that the chains only bound the hands, but the truth is the greatest chain they forged was meant for the mind. When the ships cut across the waves and the human cargo was forced below deck, they were not just stealing bodies, they were stealing worlds. The Mandinka, the Igbo, the Fawn, names that carried the weight of centuries, kingdoms, dynasties, languages, and the heartbeat of entire civilizations, were stripped away. In their place, numbers were etched into ledgers, foreign words were forced onto tongues, and new identities shaped by the oppressor's hand were sewn into the fabric of the stolen. It was a calculated act of war, not the kind fought with swords and muskets, but the kind fought in silence across generations, until even descendants might forget they ever had another name. The Mandinka were more than a people. They were heirs to an empire whose wealth and influence flowed across the West African coast, where caravans carried gold like rivers of sunlight, and griots carried the stories of heroes and ancestors through song. The Igbo were not merely a tribe, they were innovators of self-governance, a people whose villages thrived without kings, guided by councils and elders, where freedom was more than a dream, it was daily law. And the Fawn, born of Dahome's proud earth, were builders of cities, warriors whose formations and strategies rivaled any European army of the time. Yet on the auction block, all these legacies were reduced to skin color, their language replaced by foreign syllables, their histories marked as irrelevant in the ledgers of empire. But here is the truth they feared you would discover. These names were not just identifiers, they were vessels. Inside the word Mandinka is the memory of Mansa Musa's wealth and the great learning center of Timbuktu. Inside Igbo is the echo of the Aro Confederacy's influence and the trade networks that stretched like veins across West Africa. Inside Fawn is the spirit of Queen Hangbe's resilience and the military genius of the Dahomey Amazons. By erasing the name, they sought to erase the vessel, and by erasing the vessel, they hoped to drown the memory. But memory is like water. It may be diverted, it may be dammed, but it will find its way back to the sea. Imagine the first time a Mandinka child in bondage tried to tell someone their name, only for it to be beaten out of them and replaced with something alien. Imagine the Igbo elder trying to explain the meaning of his village to someone who didn't care if that village had stood for 1,000 years. Imagine the Fawn mother trying to whisper her history to her child in the dark of a slave ship, knowing the waves would drown her words before they could reach the shore. These were not just acts of cruelty, they were acts of cultural assassination. Yet history proves that memory can survive in fragments, a rhythm in a drumbeat that echoes the old war dances, a pattern in a piece of cloth that matches one worn centuries ago in a marketplace along the Niger River, a proverb spoken in a language whose vocabulary is nearly gone, yet still carries the wisdom of the ancestors. These fragments are the embers of an old fire. The task before us now is not just to warm our hands by that fire, it is to feed it until it burns bright enough to light the path forward. To know the Mandinka is to know that wealth is not merely gold, but knowledge, community, and the power to shape the destiny of your people. To know the Igbo is to understand that freedom is not granted, it is inherent, and it must be guarded with every breath. To know the Fawn is to realize that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to fight even when defeat seems certain. These lessons were carried in the names, and by hiding those names, colonizers hoped to scatter the wisdom. But here you are, hearing them again, and every time you speak them, you pull that wisdom back into the world. It is an act of defiance to remember. It is an act of power to teach, and it is an act of justice to reclaim what was stolen. The enslavers could not imagine that centuries later the descendants of the stolen would seek out the truth with such hunger. They could not imagine that the blood memory of the Mandinka would rise again in the rhythm of spoken word and music. They could not imagine that the Igbo's spirit of self-rule would emerge in movements for justice and self-determination. They could not imagine that the Fawn's warrior courage would live again in activists, teachers, and storytellers who refused to be silent. When you speak these names, Mandinka, Igbo, Fawn, you are not just reciting history, you are summoning it. You are breathing life back into kingdoms they tried to bury beneath centuries of lies. You are standing on the same ground as your ancestors, even if oceans separate you from their lands, because history does not measure distance by miles but by memory. Some will tell you to let the past rest, to focus only on the future, But the future cannot be built on a foundation of erasure. A tree cannot grow without roots, and people cannot rise without knowing the ground they stand upon. If they hid the names to destroy the memory, then remembering the names is the first stone we throw at the walls they built. This is not about revenge, it is about restoration. It is about returning the stolen pages to the book of our people's story so that it may be told in full. And when our children hear these names, they will not hear them as relics of something long gone. They will hear them as a living inheritance, because in truth, the Mandinka have not vanished, the Igbo have not disappeared, the Fawn have not been erased. They live in the blood, in the bones, in the rhythm of the heartbeats of those who walk the earth today. So say the names, teach the name, write them on the walls, sing them in the streets, carve them into the memory of every child who will carry them forward. Let the world know that no matter how many ships they sent, no matter how many whips they cracked, no matter how many names they tried to bury, they failed to kill the memory. For memory is stronger than chains, and truth is louder than silence. And the day will come when the world will no longer speak of the Mandinka, the Igbo, and the Fawn as tribes that were lost, but as nations that were reclaimed. The Mandinka, Igbo, and Fawn were among the most resilient African peoples, whose legacies were targeted for erasure during the transatlantic slave trade. Yet their courage and cultural richness have left indelible marks that time and oppression could not fully erase. These were not nameless, faceless groups. They were kingdoms and communities with deep political structures, economic systems, spiritual traditions, and artistic expressions that shaped the fabric of West Africa long before foreign ships appeared on their shores. The Mandinka, descendants of the powerful Mali Empire, carried traditions of statecraft, oral literature, and trade that spanned centuries, their griots preserving stories of kings and warriors whose deeds inspired generations. The Igbo, known for their decentralized yet highly organized communities, thrived through systems of governance that balanced personal freedom with communal responsibility, a social structure that baffled European colonizers who expected to find monarchies like those in Europe. The Fawn, rooted in the kingdom of Dahomey, built a society famed for its disciplined armies, advanced craftsmanship, and complex religious traditions that blended cosmology, history, and art into every aspect of daily life. Yet when the transatlantic slave trade reached its peak, these names were deliberately hidden, altered, or replaced in a calculated effort to break the link between the enslaved and their ancestral homeland. Traders, colonial officials, and slaveholders knew that identity was power. By stripping a person of their name and language, they hoped to sever the chain of memory, making it harder for enslaved Africans to unite, resist, or retain a sense of belonging. The renaming process was not a passive act. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. People who had been Mandinka, Igbo, or Fawn were recorded simply as Negro, slave, or assigned European first names and surnames that bore no connection to their heritage. Over time, this strategy sought to bury the knowledge of where they had come from, erasing the story of empires and villages, of rituals and lineages, from the official narrative. But culture has a way of surviving in fragments, and in the music, the rhythms, the dances, and the folk tales carried across oceans, the truth remained hidden like seeds waiting for rain. The Mandinka's kora melodies found echoes in the banjo music of the American South. The Igbo's belief in personal destiny and collective responsibility whispered through African American spirituals and proverbs. The Fawn's religious systems, carried through the Caribbean, evolved into Vodun, shaping the spiritual landscape of Haiti and other islands. Even when they tried to erase the names, they could not destroy the essence, for the essence was carried in the heart, in the body, in the shared memory that could not be cataloged in slave legend. Today, historians, linguists, and descendants are piecing together the puzzle, reclaiming these identities with a determination that matches the strength of those who once bore them. DNA testing, archival research, and oral history projects have allowed many in the diaspora to learn that their great-great-grandparents were not just enslaved people, they were Mandinka farmers, Igbo traders, Fawn artists. Each rediscovered name becomes a bridge across centuries, a restoration of honor to those who endured the unendurable. The revival of these names is more than academic, it is a political and personal act of defiance against centuries of erasure. To say I am Igbo I am Mandinka or I am Fawn is to reject the narrative that history's victors tried to write in place of truth. It is to declare that the thread was never completely cut, that the chain of memory has been reforged, and that the legacy of resistance lives on in the blood and spirit of their descendants. These names, once hidden to destroy memory, now rise again to remind the world that identity is not a gift granted by those in power. It is a birthright that no force, no matter how brutal, can truly take away. Colonial powers understood with ruthless precision that the most effective way to dominate a people was not merely through physical control, but through the dismantling of their very sense of self. And one of the sharpest tools for this was the calculated removal of their names. A name is never just a label. It is a vessel carrying generations of meaning, linking the living to ancestors and anchoring them to a homeland, language, and shared history. By erasing or replacing it, colonizers were not simply renaming individuals. They were attempting to sever the invisible cords of identity that connect a person to their roots. When an African man named Chukwemeka was forced to answer to John, or a woman called Abena was made to respond to Mary, the change was not an act of convenience, but a deliberate wound inflicted on memory. In the eyes of the colonial system, the original names were dangerous because they contained a history too vast, too dignified, and too unyielding to be compatible with subjugation. Those names carried the cadence of the mother tongue, the rhythm of clan stories, the echo of ancestral blessings. To erase them was to force silence on a lineage and make the descendants strangers to their own bloodline. In the ledgers of slave traders and colonial bureaucrats, African identities were flattened into crude generalities like boy, girl, or Negro, stripping away individuality and replacing it with terms that reduced human beings to property. This renaming was psychological warfare, designed to make the enslaved doubt their own worth and to disrupt the continuity of culture, ensuring that even if bodies survived, the traditions and memories tied to those names would not. It was not only individuals who suffered this fate. Entire tribes, kingdoms, and nations were renamed or deliberately mislabeled in historical records, erasing their true place in the global narrative. Colonial powers understood that when you remove a name, you are not just taking away a word, you are erasing the story it tells, the pride it instills, and the identity it safeguards. Yet the human spirit has an uncanny way of resisting erasure. Even under the weight of imposed identities, many kept their real names alive in whispers, in the privacy of family gatherings, in songs and coded language, in the naming of children who bore the old sounds like secret keys. These fragments, passed quietly from one generation to the next, became the seeds of reclamation centuries later. In our time, when descendants trace their lineage and discover the original names of their ancestors, it is as though a piece of stolen light has been returned. Saying those names aloud becomes an act of resistance against the systems that tried to bury them. It is a way of declaring that no matter how deep the forces of erasure attempted to dig, they could not reach the root. Those roots, unseen but unbroken, continue to feed the identity and pride of those who choose to reclaim them, reminding the world that a name reclaimed is a history restored, and a history restored is a power reborn. Even when the names of entire peoples were stripped away, when the tongues that once carried them were silenced by force, and when the official records refused to acknowledge their existence, the spirit of those identities did not vanish. Across the scattered corners of the earth where descendants of Africa found themselves, whether in the plantations of the Americas, the islands of the Caribbean, or the ports of Europe, there remained an unbroken thread woven through everyday life. It lived in the rhythms of the drum, in the syncopated beats that mirrored the hot beats of generations past, beats that could not be mistaken for anything else because they carried within them the pulse of ancestral lands. It was hidden in the call and response songs sung in the fields, where each verse carried double meanings. On the surface, they might seem like work chants or hymns, but beneath them lay coded messages of resistance, memory, and longing for home. Even in the absence of the original names, these songs served as carriers of identity, reminding the singers and their children that they came from somewhere, that they were more than the names forced upon them. The way hands clapped in certain patterns, the way feet stamped into the ground in ceremonies, the way certain melodies lingered like a whisper from the homeland, All of these were acts of quiet defiance against the machinery of erasure. Spiritual practices, too, held fragments of the lost identities in rituals that outsiders could not fully interpret. The old gods, the ancient stories, and the sacred connections to nature continued to thrive, disguised under new forms or hidden behind the masks of imposed religion. A drumbeat might call not just to gather people, but to summon the same spirits that their ancestors once honored by name. A dance might seem like celebration to the unknowing eye, but for those who understood, each movement traced the shapes of old stories. Each gesture spoke to powers that colonial systems tried to suppress. Oral traditions were perhaps the most enduring guardians of these buried identities. Around fires at night, in kitchens after long days of labor, in hushed tones when children were close enough to listen, elders told stories that carried the essence of the old names without uttering them outright. They spoke of ancestors who crossed rivers of fire, who wrestled with spirits, who built kingdoms and defended them with courage beyond measure. In the telling, they wove the history and pride of entire peoples into the imaginations of the next generation, making sure that even if the words changed, the meaning survived. These oral legacies were not written down, and perhaps that was their greatest strength. They could not be burned, confiscated, or edited by outside powers. They lived only in the minds and mouths of the people, safe from the pens of those who wished to rewrite history. Music, dance, story, and spirit became the invisible libraries where stolen names found refuge, waiting for a time when they could be spoken again without fear. And that time has come. In our present age, as descendants reconnect with their roots through research, DNA tracing, and the revival of traditional languages, the fragments carried in these cultural forms become whole again. When a song that has been sung for centuries is finally understood in its original tongue, it is as though a door to the past swings wide open. When a dance step is recognized not as mere movement but as a living archive of a people's journey, the erased name behind it begins to breathe once more. In reclaiming these names and the culture tied to them, we are not merely honoring the past, we are restoring a part of ourselves that was meant to be forgotten, proving that the human spirit once set in motion by truth cannot be silent. Across the world, descendants of Africa are rising with a hunger that is older than themselves, a pull that reaches back through generations towards something stolen, yet never completely lost. In cities and villages, on islands and continents far from the shores of their ancestors, people are piecing together the fragments of a story that was broken apart by slavery, colonization, and deliberate erasure. Through old family tales, through the rhythms of music passed down without written notes, through the taste of food that carries the memory of ancient kitchens, they are reconnecting with the languages and identities that once formed the core of who they were. DNA testing has become more than science. It has become a bridge, a way to name the places where bloodlines run deep, to find the tribes and regions whispered in family stories but never written in any official document. With each rediscovered word in an ancestral tongue, with each song sung the way it was meant to be sung, a piece of the severed thread is tied back into the tapestry of identity. Communities that were once scattered across oceans are finding one another again, building networks that cross borders and continents, sharing archives, photographs, oral histories, and cultural practices. They are learning that their stories did not end in the holds of ships or on the auction blocks. They continued in the quiet acts of resistance that kept memory alive, braiding seeds into hair for the journey, telling coded stories under the moon, singing songs that carried the names of rivers and mountains long after the words were forbidden. Now those rivers and mountains are being found again, not on maps drawn by colonizers, but in the living memory of the people who survived. Festivals are reviving ancient dances once thought to be gone. Languages are being taught to new generations with pride instead of shame. And clothing patterns once hidden are worn boldly in streets around the world. The reclamation is not just about culture, it is about power, dignity, and the refusal to allow history to remain as it was written by those who tried to destroy them. Each name restored to its rightful place is an act of defiance. Each story retold is a declaration that their history is theirs to own. This reconnection is not a return to the past, but a continuation of a journey interrupted, a merging of what was preserved with what is being rebuilt. It is a process of healing not only for individuals but for entire nations of people, proving that even centuries of separation cannot erase the truth of where they came from. And as these voices grow louder, they are rewriting the narrative, showing the world that African identity is not defined by displacement, but by the resilience and brilliance of a people who carried their roots within them, no matter how far they were scattered. Remembering the Mandinka, Igbo, and Fon is not just an act of historical interest, it is a deliberate form of resistance against centuries of calculated erasure, a refusal to let the chains of forgetting finish the work that enslavement began. These names are more than markers of origin. They are living keys to a cultural treasury, each carrying the voices, beliefs, and wisdom of ancestors who walked the earth with dignity long before their world was torn apart. To speak these names aloud is to breathe life into the memory of warriors, farmers, poets, traders, and visionaries whose contributions to human history were vast, yet whose legacies were buried under foreign narratives. The Mandinka carried empires in their history, masters of governance, strategy, and trade, who left a mark from West Africa to the Mediterranean. The Igbo, with their democratic village systems and vibrant artistic traditions, demonstrated the kind of societal balance and innovation that confounded those who sought to dominate them. The Fon, with their profound spiritual systems and artistry and diplomacy, architecture and resistance, built kingdoms that inspired awe and fear. But when these people were captured, shipped, and renamed, the aim was not just to strip them of freedom, but to sever their connection to this greatness. Colonial powers and slave traders understood that if you destroy a person's memory of who they are, you weaken their will to resist. That is why African names were replaced with foreign ones, why languages were suppressed, and why oral histories were interrupted. Yet even in the darkness of forced migration, these identities survived in fragments woven into the songs sung in fields, in the rhythm of drums that matched those of the villages left behind, in the food prepared in kitchens where memory was the only ingredient no one could confiscate. Today, the act of reclaiming these names is an act of defiance against the narratives that reduced Africa to a place of law. It is an assertion that these tribes were never erased. They were hidden in plain sight, encoded in traditions, in the resilience of family structures, in the quiet pride of those who never let the memory fully vanish. To remember the Mandinka, Igbo, and Fon is to stand in the river of time and reach back for the hands of those who came before, to pull them forward into the present where their descendants can speak their truths without fear. It is to tell the world that their kingdoms, their philosophies, and their contributions were not destroyed, merely interrupted, and now they continue through. Every time their names are spoken in classrooms, in ceremonies, in public spaces, and even in private reflection, a part of the stolen narrative is reclaimed. It is an act of cultural healing that reweaves the fabric torn by centuries of exploitation, restoring dignity not just to the descendants of these tribes, but to the entire human story. Because in remembering them, we remember that Africa was never a blank space waiting to be written upon by others. It was and remains a continent of kingdoms, innovation, and enduring spirit that no force on earth could truly erase.